$1 trillion coin. Yes, one coin worth $1 trillion. Just when you think things can't get any crazier, you see on the internet that the latest idea being thrown around about how to deal with the crisis is to mint two coins made out of platinum and declare the value of each of those coins to be worth $1 trillion each, sell those coins to the Federal Reserve, and then all that new money just gets used to be able to deal with the coronavirus, the fallout, the helicopter money, and to help fund along with the bailout packages. In order to understand the background of this, the legality of this, what the ramifications and the potential hurdles like me, the first thing we have to do is take a little time travel back to the creation of the Constitution after the Revolutionary War. Let's dive in. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it, so I apologize in advance. I know that I'm probably butchering that last name. She proposed recently that the way to deal with the individual financial impact of the coronavirus, not the bailout part, but just how to get money to individuals, the helicopter money part of it, would be for the U.S. Mint to issue two coins. Each coin would be worth $1 trillion, and then those coins would be purchased from the mint by the Federal Reserve for the $1 trillion each, and then that money, after it goes to the mint, would be swept by the Treasury over into the Treasury General account, and then it would be able to be used for this fiscal stimulus. Her idea would be to preload a bunch of debit cards and send those out to all Americans. Let's take a little step back in time, back to the American Revolution. The Continental Congress at that time needed a way to fund the Revolutionary War because, as everybody knows, wars are expensive. And so they issued Continentals. That was their money. And they started to issue more and more of them. And obviously there wasn't enough real money, gold and silver, to back up all the paper that they were printing. They experienced rampant hyperinflation to the point where it became a common saying that something's not worth a Continental. That's where that saying originated. And I believe it was George Washington that said a barrel of Continentals is not worth a barrel of goods. And so everybody in that time experienced hyperinflation from overprinting a paper currency that didn't have enough actual physical gold or silver to back it up. And so when the founding fathers, after this, they were drafting the Constitution, they specifically prohibited the federal government from being able to issue paper currency, even if it was backed up by something like gold or silver, because they knew the temptation to print in times of need was so great that it would inevitably end up happening, and it would destroy local economies like it had destroyed the colonies' economies during the war. And so they specifically prohibited this, and the only allowance regarding money given to the federal government was that they were allowed to coin money and set the value thereof. And they specifically used the word coin money because they didn't want the federal government any ability to print paper money. You could only make real money with coins. And so there was a direct link between the weight of the gold or silver of the coins and the dollar value that was assigned to it. And that was how it was interpreted going forward. Further than that, in Article 1 of the United States Constitution, it specifically prohibits even states from making anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debts. Now, everybody knows that the original intent of the Constitution was to allow the states to have a lot more freedom and authority in doing things than the federal government. It even states explicitly in the Constitution that any power that is not specifically and explicitly stated that the federal government has, it's not allowed to go beyond that, and only the states can employ any powers beyond what the federal government is explicitly allowed to do. But even further than that, it actually limits what the states can do. So the founding fathers were very, very articulate, and they were very intentional about the way that they drafted the monetary powers of the United States government and the powers that the states inside the United States of America would have regarding what they could do with money, because they had all experienced what happens when paper inflation happens. Now, as we fast forward a little bit through the rest of United States history, there were a lot of times where people tried to start central banks in America. Three times, actually, they were tried and they failed until the fourth time you get to 1913, when they were finally able to succeed with setting up the Federal Reserve. Now, there were obviously some concerns with setting up a central bank in America. The founding fathers were very against it, and so there were a lot of people that didn't want it to happen because of the potential dangers that you have when you do have a central bank. And so there were two main limitations that were placed on the Federal Reserve in order to try and avoid some of the complications and problems that you have in a country once you have a central bank. The first was a debt ceiling, because they knew that if there was a central bank, that they would just be able to print money and purchase the United States government's debt. They didn't want the temptation for the United States government to be able to create debt at will and then just have the Federal Reserve buy that debt. They knew that that would place too big of a debt burden onto the country, and it would get us into more trouble than it was worth. And so they put in a debt ceiling so that the federal government could not go past a certain limit of debt. I believe the original amount was somewhere around $65 billion. The second limitation that they placed on the Federal Reserve was that they couldn't directly purchase United States government debt. If they were going to buy United States government debt, it had to be basically old debt that had already had time to go out into the market. Now, this would do a couple of things. If the United States government needed to issue debt, it would hit the market. If they issued too much debt, then lenders to the government would demand a higher interest rate, because as we discussed in prior videos, whenever you have debt creation, that is an expansion of the monetary supply, because it's credit that expands the amount of money in the system. And so there's more inflation when you have credit creation. And so in order to compensate themselves for the higher inflation, as a lender, you're going to demand a higher interest rate in return for them holding onto your money throughout the duration of that loan. And so it was a natural way to let the free market determine how much debt the United States government could take on, because if they issued too much debt, interest rates would naturally go up, and it would put some natural brakes and some natural friction on how much debt the government could get, because at some point they're not going to be able to pay all the interest if they have, too much of a debt load. And that's why they didn't want the Federal Reserve to basically be able to directly buy the debt from them, because it's not hitting the free market. Then they can just print as much money as they want in order to buy that debt. And so it would allow a bloated debt load on the United States government. Now, the third limitation that was there that we obviously don't have anymore is the gold standard, that all dollars were backed up by gold. And it only took about 15 years for so much money to be printed that there wasn't enough gold to back it up, that FDR had to pretty much eliminate the real gold standard after the Great Depression started in order to devalue the dollar against gold. The first limitation obviously has never been a real limitation. Every time we've hit the debt ceiling, which only took a couple of years the first time, we have just Congress has just continually raised and raised and raised that debt ceiling. And while the second limitation that was placed on the Federal Reserve, that they were not able to directly purchase Treasury debt, but it had to go through the market, it is technically still in place, however, not in practice. At this point, you can see plenty of reports that show Treasury debt that hits the market, sits on a primary dealer's books for sometimes less than even a day, and sometimes by the end of the day, the Federal Reserve has already purchased it from that primary dealer. So technically, there is still that limitation, but in practice, already the Federal Reserve is just buying debt directly from the Treasury pretty much as soon as it's issued. This has never really been an issue in the past up until a couple of years ago, because primarily central banks around the world had been buying Treasury debt, and we were issuing a lot of that debt overseas. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen as much inflation as might have been expected, because a lot of that new money that's been created has been exported overseas. Now, I know as well as anybody that the inflation numbers that are put out officially are not actually representative of reality. I've made videos about that before. Independent analysis and statistics show that inflation is actually a lot higher than what the official numbers show. However, with central banks around the world no longer buying U.S. Treasury debt, they're actually selling it, and the fact that the Treasury is starting to load up on more and more debt, the Federal Reserve is pretty much turning into the only buyer of Treasuries. And that brings us to today. Right now, we are sitting in the midst of a financial crisis that was triggered by a public health crisis, and the government is scrambling to try and find ways to pay for all the stimulus and bailouts and emergency spending that they're trying to put in place right now. With the national debt already $23 trillion and spiking quickly, with the federal deficits exploding due to the fact that tax revenues are plummeting and expenditures are skyrocketing. They're trying to be more and more creative with ways in order to finance this spending. Now, previous administrations, all the way back to the very first administrations and in the drafting of the Constitution, were smart, and they set up these natural limitations in the system to prevent the federal government from having the power when they needed it most in order to just spend as much money and create as much money as they wanted out of thin air, because they knew that in times of emergency, that's when it would be used, and it would be overused, and destruction would be left in its wake. So they built in all of these firewalls and these natural protections in order to prevent things like this from happening. That's why the Federal Reserve is separate from the United States government. That's why they are separate, and that's why Congress doesn't have the ability to print money at will. There are these natural barriers and boundaries to go through that make spending and increasing spending harder and harder. That's why when they said in the Constitution, coin money and set the value thereof, you're talking about assigning a specific value to a weight of metal. That's why when FDR devalued the dollar, he had to take the dollar from $20.67 or $25, $35, and over the years, every time gold was devalued up until Nixon, it was hit $37 and then $40 and then $45, I think, per ounce, until finally he decoupled altogether from gold. There's always been a specific value assigned to a weight of metal. And with the debt ceiling being reached and the debt exploding and people wondering how is the government even going to pay interest on their debt load if interest rates go up at all, is the Federal Reserve going to be able to keep a lid on interest rates? They think, hey, this is a very creative way to kind of get around all of this. What if we issue a new coin made out of platinum? What if we issue a new coin and just say it's worth $1 trillion? And then the Federal Reserve can just give us that $1 trillion and no new debt is created. The first question is it legal? Well, technically it is. Under 31 U.S. Code Section 5112K, Congress gave the U.S. Mint the ability to produce platinum coins and decide the value of them. The original purpose of this section was to allow the Mint to create smaller denomination platinum coins, because there were a lot of platinum coin collectors who were complaining about the value of platinum being too high for them to be able to afford the regularly sized coins. So this was passed in order to allow the Mint to create smaller coins so that they could make them in smaller denominations that were more affordable for collectors. But since there is no explicit limitation on where it can go, either up or down in terms of size, it is technically possible for the United States Mint to do this. Now, the problem that is faced here is that historically, assigning a value to a coin has always been used in terms of weight to dollar, which would mean that if they did this in the traditional way, you'd be assigning a new legal value of platinum. Even if you made a gigantic coin out of platinum, there would still be a dollar value assigned to that metal, in which case anybody that had any platinum would see a sizable spike in the value of their assets. Now, the federal government obviously wants to avoid this because they don't want any connection between something with intrinsic value and the value of the dollar. They don't want that connection back because it would, in the end, lead to a severe restriction on the amount of spending that they can do. And so the way around this, instead of having it be a bullion coin, which is the dollar to weight value that's assigned, this would be a proof coin. It would be just a special one-off coin that was designed for a specific purpose. And it would be that coin alone that was worth $1 trillion and not a weight of platinum worth $1 trillion. Now, the best part about this proposal is that it would take 2 coins in order to fund it. If it was just one coin, then it would be easier for everybody to look at this and say, this was a one-time emergency spending procedure and we'll never do it again. It was a $2 trillion coin, and that's the only time we're going to do that. But since in the very first usage of this section and implementing policy in this way, you do 2 coins, you remove the stigma from just having just one coin doing this, and you open the door for a third and a fourth and a fifth at any time. And so essentially what they're trying to do here is they're trying to eliminate all the restrictions and boundaries on the government spending. And they would essentially be able to do it with this. Now, the U.S. government really doesn't have any real restrictions on spending right now because they can just issue as much debt as they can, and it's all purchased by the Treasury. And the United States government doesn't even pay any interest on its debt that's held at the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve sweeps all of its profits back into the Treasury. So any interest that's paid from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve goes straight back to the Treasury. So all of the debt that the United States government has held by the Federal Reserve is already interest-free. So they don't really have any limit other than the debt ceiling and public perception on how much they can spend. However, this would be a way to eliminate some of the legwork, eliminate some of those hoops that they have to jump through, and eliminate the social stigma of having a larger and growing debt. This would also basically eliminate any of the boundaries that were set up between the printing press and Congress, because now if this is allowed to happen, any time that they want to pass a large spending bill, the only thing you have to do is direct the U.S. Mint to produce another $1 trillion coin and have the Federal Reserve send that money on over. So in conclusion, the entire Constitution and history of monetary policy in the United States was designed with barriers and restrictions in mind to really prevent the federal government from having a printing press and having the ability to spend as much money as they wanted whenever they wanted it with zero restrictions. Moving forward with a policy that would allow these powers to the United States government, I don't see any benefit long term from that. It sets precedents, and especially the fact that there's two coins that are each worth $1 trillion and not just one removes any stigma from doing it again. It bypasses the natural market forces of having to issue debt that would demand a higher interest rate, that would put restrictions on how much of a debt load the United States government could afford, and ultimately will usher in the end of the power and the reign of the United States dollar as the global reserve currency even faster than it's already coming. So I hope this explanation about the $1 trillion coin idea helps. If you do have any questions about the proposal that I did not answer, or if anything that I said was confusing, please let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer any questions or clarify anything that I might have not been as clear about. I would also love to thank all of you. I finally passed 3,000 subscribers on this channel, and I couldn't appreciate you guys more. It really does mean so much to me that you guys continue to watch videos and that I can provide some value to you guys and some clarification on all of the monetary, fiscal, investing, and financial madness that is going on out there right now. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Have a good day.